Cleveland had passed away yesterday, and funeral arrangements are on Wednesday. He is one of our not only oldest, but longest members here. He was here when I got here in '85, and Andrea and I got to thinking about it yesterday and starting to look around. And Robert Golden was here when we got here. And Ray, I'm trying to remember, you was here, correct? I thought so. Um, so Ray and Brother Golden were here when I got here, and then I was here in '85, and all the rest of you are young pups. Y'all got here after that. So, but keep Brother Cliff's family in your prayers for that. Also, Brother Glenn is not doing that great. Dot worn down from taking care of him after her chemotherapy and all. So keep both them and the families in your prayer. I'm sorry. Okay. On top of that, she's got bronchitis. If you saw the email also, Linda Johnson snuck off. She moved to Ohio without us knowing about it after the fact. Email says she's going to be up there about a year, but if she's going to be there that long, I'm not sure she's going to be heading back. Brother Dave is going to have his surgery this Monday, tomorrow, scheduled for 6 a.m., Baptist South. After the surgery, he'll be in the hospital probably a week, give or take a day or two. The Ashley, Brother Andrew is going to have his foot surgery the following Monday, not tomorrow, but the next Monday on his foot. Charles is still in the hospital and not doing good. Brother Terry, we need to always keep him in our prayers. Who am I missing? It seems like there's Holly is more good than bad, but still having some back issues, pain. Brother Carden, got to keep him in our prayers while he's in Marine boot camp. Is there anyone else that I have failed to mention? Yeah. Caleb Colquitt, there's a newspaper clipping on the board out there if you want to read it about him. It's a real nice article. Also, Emily is going back to Dunban. If they send her home, we're at least think we're heading in the right direction. Good. Anyone else? No, huh? Amy and Josh are getting married on the 3rd. You think. Brother Jeremy, would you lead us in a prayer, please, before we begin class? Okay, Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. Verse 1 starting out says, and Saul, and this is not the first time we've heard his name, but we haven't really gotten down talking about him yet. And I think that would probably be the best thing to do is just discuss Paul just a little bit. And what do we know about Saul, who will later become Paul? What do we know about him? Very well educated in the Jewish faith because he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. What else do we know about him? Of the Pharisee sect? Had Roman citizenship. How do we know that? Scriptures say it, right? Okay. Where was he born? Where was Saul born? Tarsus. Where was Saul raised and educated? Pardon? Wherever Gamaliel lived. Okay, good answer. Somebody go to Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22 and verse 3. Acts 22 and verse 3. Okay, this city would mean Jerusalem. That's where Gamaliel, because he was head of the Sanhedrin council. He says he was a Jew. He also, as Brother Jim Hammond said, was a Roman citizen. Now, to give you a little bit of background on how he is a Roman citizen, Tarsus at one time was not in the Roman Empire, but back around the 60s BC, they were a quiet people. They didn't fuss about the Romans, so Anthony made Tarsus a free city. So by Saul's parents being Roman citizens, that made Saul a Roman citizen. Now, we will not find this in Scripture, but how old is Saul? Anybody got any ideas, clues? Depending on which authority you go to, and when I personally start looking at Jewish people and getting back into the history in this area, I go to Jewish sources. And according to them, and depending again on which one you look at, he was either born in 5 or 10 AD, which would make him a little bit younger than Christ. Does that make a difference? No, but I'm just trying to give you some fill in and trying to help us along here. So Tarsus from Jerusalem, we're going to do a little geography now. So if you're sitting down here at Jerusalem, and later on in this chapter, we're going to talk about a place called Damascus. Where is Damascus in relationship to Jerusalem? North to, I guess on our map today, we would say north-northeast or more north than east, but up that way. How far is it from Jerusalem? My sources put it more closer to 120, but and then from Damascus, where would we find Tarsus? Up north again and sort of to the west, because you got to go around that little, around the med there just a little bit. So, and how far would Tarsus then be from Damascus? Uh, 250 to somewhere in that range. So if you add those two together, because unless you take some back roads, as we would say, to get from Tarsus to Jerusalem, you're going to go through Damascus. So if you add those two together, Tarsus from Jerusalem is roughly 370 or so miles, 370 to 400 miles. So that's just giving you a little bit of layout, because when we think about these folks back in those days, when they travel around and everything, they're mainly on foot or in a chariot. Well, when we think of chariot, what do we think about? A war machine. But they had chariots that were made that would be more like what we would call a carriage. When on the road, the Ethiopian eunuch, what did it say about him in the chariot? Wasn't he sitting? In a war machine, they're not sitting, they're standing. There's one driving, there's one watch out. Well, let me back up. Generally speaking, the chariots that we think about, the war machines, they had three people on board. There was the warrior that did the fighting, there was the driver, and then the warrior's aide, which kept handing him weapons and sort of on the lookout. So, Brother Terry? Correct. I know for a fact that it is mentioned all the way back in the book of Genesis, but we don't know just how far back it goes. But as Brother Clarence said, it's the oldest inhabited city that we know of, and I believe that is absolutely correct. But Tarsus is now in an area that we would, on our map today, would be more into Turkey. So that just gives you a little bit of layout of the land here, and who Saul was. What else do we know about Saul? He was a passionate persecutor of Christians. What else? While he's still Saul, not when he changes to Paul, but still on Saul, what do we know? It was named after the king. Anything else? I'm sorry? Consented to Stephen's death while he was still Saul. What about his health? All right. What was the thorn in the flesh? This is sort of a trick question now. But what was the thorn in the flesh? Okay. We're not absolutely sure. Some say poor eyesight. And why do we think that it might have been poor eyesight? Okay. But historically speaking, just about everybody had a scribe to help them do their writing for them. There's also a reference in Galatians. Somebody look at Galatians 6, verse 11. Galatians 6:11, I think, is the one I'm looking for. And when you start to read it, well, never mind. Read it. Galatians 6:11. See which large letters I have written to you with my own hand, and you are not using a King James version. You are either using New King James, ESV, or a whole host of others. The King James says large letter, not plural. Why do I make that distinction? It could have been a difference in the size of the letters themselves, or it could have been a difference in the size of the whole letter. So we take it to be that it is poor eyesight based on that one passage. There's no other passage in the scripture that will tell you what his thorn in the flesh was. Some traditional writings from the Jews and others say that thorn in the flesh could have been something as severe as epilepsy or some neurological condition that would make him form the letters bigger. Now, the only reason they say that it's possible that it was epilepsy was that in the Greeks, the holy disease was epilepsy. Epilepsy was called the holy disease. Again, does that make a difference? No. But we need to know that because how many people today try their best to do everything in the world they can to destroy miracles by making them natural events? Go back to the book of Exodus, the miracles, the 10 miracles that were performed to get them out of Egypt. Scientists today come up with all kinds of theories of how that was natural events that just built on each other. Well, the reason I bring that up is that when we get down a few more verses, we get into where a bright light shone at noonday, and he was blind for 3 days. Well, your scientists today say that it was probably a medical condition called myopia. Let me read that. Amaurosis. And that is a condition today that happens when people are exposed to bright light, that they can temporarily lose their vision and then it come back. I know Bobby and a couple of others in here, when we've been out on the shooting range or in other events at night, the muzzle flash of the weapon will cause you temporary. And for us people who are having slow-going cataracts, if we're out in the bright sun without sunglasses, good sunglasses on, when we walk in a building, we're as blind as a bat for a while until our eyes get to be focused again. But they even, I'll get to you in just a second, they even subdivide those into day and night. Well, in the case of Saul here, when this happened to him, it was both day and night. There was no division. So we need to remember that even though they try to dispel his seeing this bright light as a natural occurrence and weed out miracles, I believe the evidence points to a miracle taking place when he saw and talked to Christ. Brother Joel. Yep. And if you don't have the right kind, you can even get reflections coming in the side. So, Brother Cox. Mm-hmm. Well, they have got a whole host of theories, but we don't want to get into that right now. But they're talking about, well, it starts out, just to give you a brief overview, it starts out with the blood. Well, that was a bacteria in the water that turned it red, and then nothing can live, so all the fish are going to die from that. And then the dead fish, and then your frogs, and then the frogs are going to lay a bunch of eggs because there's nothing to kill the frog eggs, and then all the frogs hatch and they go out, and then, I mean, it just snowballs from that. So, but we've got to me, it's not logical. They don't want to get into that part. Okay, back to chapter 9 and verse 1. We've discussed Saul quite a bit, and we might look at some other things about him as we go along, but it says, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went into the high priest. Well, we already know from our last chapter, chapter 8 and verse 3, that he persecuted the church. But here, if you look at the language, what does it mean if you say breathing out threatenings? Is that just talking about him or threatening? I think that's where we need to go because of exactly what Bobby said. His whole life was dedicated to eradicating the church in its infancy before it got a start. So breathing out again is term used in Greek poetry and Greek literature, just meaning, I guess, along the lines of the hatred or the vehemently opposed to or something of that nature. So his main mission in life at this point was to destroy the church before it ever got started. Brother Clunch? Correct. As Brother Clunch just said, that this also indicates that the church was a whole new and different thing. It wasn't a sect of any Jewish religion, wasn't an offshoot of it. Brother Jim? Okay. And then the last part of that was he went in unto the high priest, continuing in verse 2, and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Why would he want to go to the high priest for a letter? Authority. Now, here's why we went into that little bit of geography. He's wanting to go to Damascus, to the synagogue in Damascus, 120 odd miles away. What does that tell you then about the rule or structure that's going on with the Jewish religion? The high priest didn't have authority in Jerusalem. The high priest in Jerusalem had authority of the Jews all over. There is a religious group today who we can look at in the same way. Is the Pope the rule over Rome, or over the citadel in Rome? How far does the Pope's rule reach? Everywhere there's a Catholic. So the history I've studied shows that the Roman Catholic Church sort of took this from the Jewish religion, the way they set up their structure and all. But here it reached all over, and the chief priest was in charge of everything going on and could give him the authority, the letter, to go anywhere into a synagogue and do this. Brother Golden. Caligula. Well, I agree with everything you've said up to the point of you don't believe they would have, because there was a balance going on. The Romans allowed the Jews to do everything ecclesiastical. It was theirs to decide and do. But then on the civil, it was the Romans that was in charge. If you recall, when Pilate agreed to put Christ to death, he found no fault in him, but he allowed him to do it because the Jews wanted it done. So, and he was trying to keep peace. All right, that's the way. And also, I'm glad that you brought up the time frame here, because if you look at it, chapters 1 through 8 cover about a 2-year period of time. And then when we get into chapter 8, somewhere around verse 5 of chapter 8, up until about chapter 13, we're dealing with a 13-year period of time. And then the rest of Acts covers about a 14-year period of time. So where we're looking at right now is, as you say, somewhere around 37 or so AD. Questions, comments? Okay. So he's getting his letter of authority. He's going to go get all these people that they believe is breaking the ecclesiastical law, take them back to Jerusalem and deal with them. Verse 3 says, and he journeyed. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. I believe it's Acts 22 and Acts 22 and 6, I believe is what I'm looking for. Acts 22 and 6.
And it came to pass that as I made my journey, drew nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about.
Okay. I wanted to fill that in because he's not just near Damascus, he's near Damascus about noontime. And then at noontime there shined round about him a light from heaven. How bright would a light have to be at noon to get your attention versus at dusk or dawn? Have to be pretty bright, wouldn't it? So the light from heaven came about noontime to him. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Is that a fair question? Go to Galatians 1 and verse 13. Galatians 1 and 13.
For ye have heard of my manner of life in time past in the Judaism, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and made havoc of it.
Okay, and then we're going to go to Acts chapter 26. Acts chapter 26, 9 through 11.
I verily thought to myself that I ought to do many things contrary in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and this I also did in Jerusalem, and I both shut up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I gave my oath against them, and punishing them oftentimes in all the synagogues, I strove to make them blaspheme, and being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto Thorn.
Wow. Does not fill in what Bobby was telling us, that he was bent on that, and when he says that he attempted to get them to blaspheme, what can you imagine was taking place? I heard the word torture come from someplace. If he was a Roman citizen, he had been around Rome. The Roman soldiers and the Romans were masters at torture. They would bring you to the brink of death and sort of revive you and start over again if they hadn't got what they wanted. So it seems to me that this just, again, indicates how severe Saul wanted to persecute the church, and just how, how good he was at doing his job. Brother Clunch? Yeah. When you've done it unto the least of them, you've done it unto me. So that just fills in that where he says, why do you persecute me? Because Saul was persecuting the Christians. So do it unto them, you do it unto me, him being the head of the church. Great comments. Anything else? Verse 5, and he said, who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, all right, now, before we go on with this, the Lord is used 2 times here. But the first time it's used, it would mean more like sir, or just as a something of honor, because he didn't know who God was or who Christ was at that time, because he said, who art thou? So why would he say Lord? It was just a manner of speaking. I'm old school. I'm 70 years old. When I grew up in the country in North Alabama, anybody that was an adult, we called sir or ma'am. Today, yeah, nay, no. You don't get the kind of respect today from young people to old people as I grew up. And then that was reinforced in the military. Anybody that outranked you. Well, today when I go into a store, I don't care who it is. If they ask me a question, regardless of age, I'm yes sir, no ma'am, or something of that nature. That's ingrained in me as just a way to speak. And here it was their manner of speaking, not knowing that if they were somebody more important or not. So he says, who art thou? Then the second place when the Lord said, then we're talking about, instead of a sir or ma'am, Lord. So there's 2 different things we need to look at there. And then he said, I am Jesus whom thou persecuted. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Other places you'll see ox goad. What is an ox goad? Or what's the prick here? Pardon? It is a pointy stick. Little pointy stick or a big pointy stick? Pretty good size. Normally they would be, through historical change, not the Bible, but normally the ox goads were somewhere between 6 and 8 feet long. They had a pointy piece of metal. If they were really good, they had a pointy piece of metal stuck in one end, and then they had a flat piece of metal attached to the other end. Now, what was the flat piece of metal for? Cleaning their plows, scraping off the dirt. What was the pointy end for? Getting the animal to go, jabbing them in the rump. And when it says hard to kick against the pricks or the goads, if you had that long stick and you poked the ox to get him to go, he might kick, but what's he going to hurt? Only himself, maybe, because if you're poking and he's kicking, he's adding pressure to the poke, but he's not going to get to you. So it's hard to kick against the push that way. Verse 6 says, and he, meaning Saul, trembling and astonished. Why would he be trembling? Okay, let's back up and start with the astonished part. I don't think there's any question that anybody in here, if a bright light came down right now surrounding me and the Lord started talking to me, I would absolutely be astonished. I don't think there'd be any doubt about that in anybody's mind that they'd be the same way. Now, why would he be trembling? Bingo. Now, the Lord has spoken to him, and he is scared to death because he knows what he has done. He has a right to be afraid. He has a right to tremble. And this is actually, and now he's got to do some other things, but isn't this actually the very point of his conversion? Lord, you are real. Lord, I have done all this. Lord, I'm going to have to change my ways, because what's his next question? What will thou have me do? If he had not realized what he had been doing was wrong and that the Lord, Christ, was who Christ was, why would he then say, what do you want me to do? Because he now went from total, in my opinion, OC. He was absolutely obsessed with persecuting the church to now totally submissive. Brother Jim and then Brother Terry. And he got it direct. Brother Clunch? Correct. From a high priest to the high priest. Absolutely correct. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Christ could have very easily said, Saul, you're now one of my disciples, one of my apostles. Saul, you're saved. Saul, do this. But that was not the plan. If you recall back when Jesus was walking about on earth, what was the plan? He taught, how many people did Christ himself baptize? None. He used the plan that was going to be put in place then and in this spot also, because he tells him to go into the city and it shall be told thee what thou shalt do. So today we follow the same plan. It's up to people to teach people and to carry out the plan. Anything else? By the way, on the ox goad that we was talking about, back in the book of Judges 3 and somewhere around 31, I think. How many people did Shamgar kill with just the ox goad? 600. So it was a fearsome weapon too, wasn't it, Bob? Okay, verse 7. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. If we go over to Acts 22 and verse 9, Acts 22 and verse 9. It says, "And they that were with me saw indeed the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me." How can you in chapter 22 not hear the voice that speaks to him, but here in verse 7 of chapter 9 says, hearing a voice but seeing no man? How do you reconcile those two or harmonize those two verses? It would be very similar to me standing next to someone speaking a foreign language. I hear them, but I don't hear them. I don't understand them. So I think that's the same thing that how those two harmonizes. They didn't see because they saw the light, they didn't see. They heard a noise, but they didn't understand what was being said to Saul at that point. Verses 8 and 9 go together. Saul arose from the earth, and well, it all fell down, not literally falling, but just went prostrate. That was one way that they did things to be reverent. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man, but they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. He saw no man because he was blind. We've already talked about the blindness aspect of it. And then he was there for 3 days without sight. That's day and night, 3 whole days without sight. Why do you think he didn't eat or drink? It was their custom back in those days, if they were going to meditate on something or really think about something, that they would be fasting while they was doing it. So there's no real mystery here that the 3 days he was blind, Christ had already told him what to do. You go in and somebody will come and tell you what to do. In the meantime, for those 3 days, he is in deep thought about everything that has transpired. And then in verse 10, there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision, "Ananias," and he said, "Behold, I am here, Lord." We don't know much about Ananias except what it says in the scriptures here, that he was a disciple at Damascus. He must have been a very good person, or else the Lord wouldn't have chosen him. He'd have chosen somebody else. And he told him, he was going to tell him what to do, and he said, and the Lord said unto him, "Arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for behold, he prayeth." Again, he's in deep thought. "And has seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him that he might receive his sight." So Christ has paved the way here. He's telling Ananias what he should do, and that Saul is going to accept him, and he's told Saul who to expect to help guide him along the way. Just as a side note, do you find it interesting that the place he is going to find him is on a street called Straight? The street called Straight. Now remember that from Jerusalem going up to Damascus, they're going northeast, and the straight street runs from east to west, from the east gate to the west gate, about 3 miles through the city. But Paul is found on the straight street. Like I said, it's probably nothing, but I just find it interesting because what Sister Ashley said, going back to Matthew 7, the straight and narrow. That is correct. Brother Client said him being an apostle, he didn't meet all the right qualifications, and he even himself says that he was one born out of due season, I think is the way that's phrased. So thank y'all so much for your questions and comments, and we'll pick up here at verse 13 on Wednesday night. Thanks again.